the Wade Center's podcast.
The podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. We're really excited today because we have with us a new board member on the Wade Advisory Board who was invited because he wrote this fantastic scholarly article for Seven, which is the journal that the Wade produces. And this article is grappling with an issue that needs to be discussed, and we're going to try to discuss today, and that is Tolkien's attitude about allegory.
Unfortunately, we can't give this person's name out. This is an anonymous interview.
The scholar's name is Graham Shea, and he was inspired to explore Tolkien's view of allegory because of the very last story that Tolkien ever published, called Smith of Wooton Major. And I would just like to ask you, Graham, what got you interested in Smith of Wooton Major? Frankly, I had never heard of this story until I read your Seven article.
Well, I think I actually discovered it at the Wade Center.
Cool.
I've been coming as often as I can for about 12 years now, and just going to the reading room and browsing the stacks. And I think that Smith of Wooton Major was one of those things that I was just cruising along and saw on the shelf, and it looked interesting. And I think I just ordered it, because I didn't want to waste time reading it while I was at the Wade Center. I had to keep on browsing, but I got it, and I think I had it for several months before I ended up reading it. But finally, there was one day I tried to take once a month and just kind of go out to this little cabin and have a quiet silence and solitude. And I sat down and read Smith of Wooton Major, and it just floored me.
Wow. And tell us why it floored you.
I think it just hit me really powerfully emotionally. And for a short story to do that really says something. He describes, so there's the short version, the original published version, which I actually have my copy right here. It's this pocket-sized little humble volume that has some beautiful illustrations by Pauline Baynes.
Let me just tell our listeners, Pauline Baynes is the person who did the drawings for the Narnia Chronicles. So if you have volumes with the old drawings, that's Pauline Baynes. So she knew both Lewis and Tolkien.
She did other Tolkien works. As a matter of fact, Tolkien's the one who recommended her to illustrate Narnia.
Every time I come to the Wade, I'm discovering more things that she's done, and it's so much fun. But then there's an extended edition, which has essays all about the writing of it, and it's like getting the bonus features on your DVD. And in that, he describes fairy as almost as an experience, and I think that was his description. He says that fairy includes both ruth and delight, and ruth is this. It's painful. It's something that's poignant, and I think that's the perfect description of what I felt. It was both this ruth and delight. It literally brought me to tears, and because it just hit something very deep about life, about my experiences in life, and with beauty, and it's very difficult to put words to, but that was the experience that I had.
Here's an etymological note: ruth is the same root as ruthless.
Yes.
You have no feelings. You have no remorse.
Yeah.
And the word rue that A.E. Housman writes in a poem, "With rue my heart is laden," is that same root as ruth. Yeah, the feeling of kind of unexplainable sadness.
Yeah.
Okay. And this story is very different from The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, even from Leaf by Niggle, which we have discussed in a podcast. And let me just read the opening paragraph, because there is a type of wittiness here that makes it feel closer to our world than Lord of the Rings is. There was a village once, not very long ago for those with long memories, nor very far away for those with long legs. Wooton Major, it was called because it was larger than Wooton Minor, a few miles away deep in the trees, But it was not very large, though it was at that time prosperous, and a fair number of folk lived in it, good, bad, and mixed, as is usual. And so it feels closer to life as we understand it, at least in that opening paragraph, because we all know that things are far away, that there's good, bad that we encounter in life. And he continues in that vein. So it's interesting read because it's not, if I had read that paragraph, there's no way I would have thought this is by Tolkien.
It's not a hobbit. There was a hobbit and lived in the world.
Right.
It's also very English because you go to England, they have upper slaughter and lower slaughter.
Yes.
And nether stowy. What's the opposite of nether stowy? There's another stowy.
Alta stowy. I don't know.
Heaven stowy? I don't know.
Upper stowy?
There may be.
But that whole idea of two villages with similar names is very English.
Well, can somebody kind of summarize the story? Because that'll help us when we talk about your essay. And then also, apparently, as you mentioned in your essay, that he's responding to The Golden Key by George MacDonald. So it's this like Russian nesting doll of inspiration and stories. So
true,
can we unpack that a little bit?
Yeah.
Can somebody tell us
Why don't you, Graham,
give us a summary of the story?
Summarize the story since it so profoundly moved you.
Sure. So it starts with a cake.
Yes.
And we'll get more into this when we talk about the origins of the story and the Golden Key. But there's this in this village, Wooton Major, there's a festival, and it's every 24
years, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a festival for children, and so you have to be in this select group to be able to get in and be one of the lucky attendees of this festival where this great cake is built, and it's the pinnacle of the career of the cook who is at the great hall to cook this cake and to serve it, and he's judged, and it's sort of his one chance to be the greatest artist of his time. And the cook has a apprentice, and the apprentice has this mysterious kind of aura about him, but he puts into the cake a fairy star, which we don't know exactly what it is, but one of the children swallows the star, and it changes him.
Yes.
He becomes instantly sort of more graceful, and he's a blacksmith, and the things that he makes are beautiful. And
he can sing.
Yes, he can sing. Time goes by, and he begins visiting fairy. And we don't know exactly where that is. It's somewhere deep in the woods. We don't know exactly how this star gives him access to fairy, and he doesn't know exactly how, but somehow there's a connection between that star and his ability to go to fairy and to have this string of profound adventures over the course of his lifetime.
Well, the star comes back up, and now it's all shiny, and he puts it on his brow, right? It doesn't have a silver star.
It sort of appears there naturally.
It appears on his...
Yeah, but other people can't see it, right?
His family can see it.
Oh, his family can, okay.
Well, and it seems like it depends on the viewer as to whether they can see it or not.
Okay.
But that's kind of Tolkien-esque because he has this thing about having a gem on your brow. Aragorn, when he tells the riders of Rohan that he is actually Aragorn the Elfstone, Legolas and Gimli look at him and say they saw this sparkling star on his brow. So there's some kind of symbolism there, which is very Tolkien-esque.
Right. Even the Queen of Fairy later in the story calls him Starbrow, which sounds a little more Lord of the Ringsy.
Yeah.
So he has these adventures, and at some point he's forced to give up the star.
Yes.
And he does so willingly. And there's a bit of a subplot that starts to come to the surface toward the end of the book where we realize that the apprentice, this mysterious person who was working in the kitchen, was actually the king of fairy. And that he's been busy this whole time kind of working in the town undercover and bringing the town back to life because this town has been in artistic decline. And it's a cultural pathology, basically, where people are becoming more utilitarian and valuing beauty less and less. And so essentially what we see is that this was a mercy mission from the world of fairy to the world of men undercover. And while the king of fairy is doing his work, Smith himself is being influenced by fairy. And what part of what's so beautiful to me in the story is that you see how Smith and his family are on the inside of this, and there are actually other families that are mentioned that are naturally drawn in the same direction of loving beauty. And so the way that I see the story is that it's a family that appreciates art and beauty and that deep numinous quality of them that gets to be used to bring back their whole town. And there's a sense of vicariousness in how beauty transforms a whole community and redeems it and brings it back to health.
Right. Rather than power or status, because there is this former master cook named Noakes who just attributes his ability to make a cake, and it's all him, not even realizing that his apprentice, this guy named Alf, has helped him out, and he's just becomes greedier and fat and self-interested, and this image of almost, you could say, like a golem creature, but he's a real man, like many people we have all encountered in life that are so obsessed with their own status and abilities that they don't recognize beauty or the power of others.
I wanted to add in the name Alf seems innocent enough for the apprentice, who turns out to be the fairy king. But Alf is a variant of elf. So I wonder if you don't learn until I didn't even suspect it. For me, it was a surprise ending. The apprentice says that's a fairy star. Now, children don't eat a cake if they're sharp objects.
Yeah, seriously.
So this is kind of like Cracker Jacks. There's going to be something in there, but don't eat it. But I was kind of feeling that Alf is the true artist who brings fairy and enchantment and wonder.
Yes.
And Noakes is kind of the false artist who just does it for the status.
That's good.
He's you wouldn't say phoning it in a Tolkien story, but he's doing perfunctory work.
Well, I was also struck, and this is totally not related to the conversation, so we don't have to mention, but I was struck by the apprentice-master relationship, and that he gives the star up, and then another boy eats it in the cake, and they're sort of passing it down, this idea of like artistry being something that's taught and that's learned and that's shared, as opposed to a single artist who has like no inspiration. Like that was just a very different approach as opposed to the utilitarian kind of perspective. So that just stood out to me. It's a thing that I think we've lost in the world today, where it's like one person comes up and they do something all on their own and they're not relying on anybody else. So that master apprentice thing just seemed
it's also
fresh and new, medieval.
The last shall be first.
Yeah.
But we're starting to allegorize the story, and a lot of Graham's article is Tolkien didn't like allegory. What are we doing here? Why are we talking about the artist who enchants the village?
Well, hey, before we get into that, what's the Golden Key? Because he was inspired to write this, or it was like an introduction to the Golden Key at some point.
Yeah, Tolkien was asked to write an introduction for the Golden Key,
which is by MacDonald.
Right, George MacDonald. And initially he said, "Oh, great, I love the Golden Key." And he went and he reread it, and I think upon rereading, he said, "Actually, I don't think I like it as much as I thought. I remembered I did."
Yeah,
and it bothered him, and he started to write the introduction, and that's actually that fragment is published in the extended edition, and it's very negative. And he realized how negative he was being about it, and he wanted to sort of give an example of what was wrong with the Golden Key. And so he started to write the first chapter or the first section of Smith of Wooton Major, and then he realized he had a story that he wanted to write as a story.
Only Tolkien would be asked to write an introduction for another book and then end up writing a book himself.
Yeah.
So what is the Golden Key about?
He wrote Prefaces to Paradise Lost.
Well, that's true.
And there were several things that bothered him about Paradise Lost, and so he wrote Paralandra to correct what he considered to be some oversights on Milton's part.
So, so what's the Golden Key about? Just very briefly, what was he reacting to?
I think MacDonald had dental work, and they used laughing gas. And when he woke up, he said, "Hey, I've got a story." There's two main. Well, Graham, you probably know better than I do.
I don't think I do. I love the Golden Key. I mean, for the record, I don't necessarily agree with all of Tolkien's taste criticism of MacDonald. I'm a big fan of MacDonald as well as of Lewis, but my sort of goal in this article was to understand, where is Tolkien coming from? Can I read him sympathetically? rather than just jumping in with my own opinion. What does he
Right.
mean by his critique here?
Well, Tolkien had very strong opinions and expressed them in almost hyperbolic ways. When he read Dorothy Sayers' detective fiction, he said, "I cannot stand Lord Peter Wimsey, and even worse is Harriet Vane, and worst of all is their creatrix, Dorothy Sayers."
Oh, no.
But then he also pronounced against Shakespeare. So Sayers and MacDonald and Shakespeare are in good company with Shakespeare. He also...
Seems like he only liked his own writing.
No, well, he didn't like Narnia. He thought Narnia. Well, let's get back to the Golden Key.
What is he reacting to, I guess, then? What is the overarching thing in Golden Key that he didn't like that he's reacting to?
I have two guesses. It's very much a fantasy story in which they discover the world of fairy.
Mm-hmm.
There's two little children named Mossy and Tangle. George MacDonald has the most interesting names for his children.
Mm-hmm.
And Mossy is a little boy who's told a story that if you get to the end of the rainbow, you will find a golden key. So he follows the rainbow into fairyland,
Mm-hmm.
and even when it gets dark, the rainbow still shines, and it has even more colors than the Earth's rainbows. And he finds the key, but then he doesn't know where's the lock that this key goes to.
Oh, gotcha.
So his adventure starts with finding a golden key.
Mm-hmm.
The other character is named Tangle. She's a little girl who lives in kind of poor circumstances, and her hair is tangled.
Mm.
And the fairies don't like her family because they like beauty and aesthetics and nature.
Mm.
And here's this kind of little hovel that's not well kept up.
Yeah.
Now, one of my guesses is that Tolkien, MacDonald tends to moralize. He says,
Yes.
fairies don't like untidy people. If you want the fairies to like you, make your bed and sweep the floor.
Yeah.
And he does that in a lot of his stories. He says, now, the princess didn't act like a princess. She cried. And I'm sure he's thinking of all of his own daughters and his own children, but I don't think he liked that moralistic note. There's also, I don't know if I would call it self-indulgent symbolism or an excess of symbolism, but Tangle gets scared by the fairies. Then she goes out and gets captured by a tree, but an airfish comes and frees her and takes her to the cottage of this beautiful old lady who's very similar to Irene in the Princess and the Goblin.
Wow.
And she says, "I'm thousands of years old, but I'm beautiful." But then the airfish clean up little Tangle, and then when they have a meal, one of the airfish jumps into the stew pot, and they eat the airfish. And she goes, "Well, is that a good thing?" No, they don't mind. They like to be. But then the spirit comes out of the pot, and now it's an air flower. So it went from being an airfish to an air flower.
MacDonald is so crazy sometimes.
Yeah.
I could go into more detail, but they grow up and have a lot of adventures. They go to a land of shadows, but there's nothing casting the shadows. So they try to find what is casting the shadows. And eventually they meet the old man of the sea, the old man of the earth, and you get the feeling that they're learning to be prepared for dying and learning to have hope for the afterlife. At least that's what I'm getting out of it.
Gotcha.
I get confused. I keep thinking, did I fall asleep and dream that part, or was I still reading?
Well, Graham, in your essay, which maybe we could turn to now,
Sure.
you actually kind of summarize this. I'm looking at page 31 in your article on 7, where MacDonald says the best thing you can do for your fellow next to rousing his conscience is not give him things to think about, but to wake things up that are in him. In everything that God has made, there is a layer upon layer of ascending significance. And then you go on to say that essentially, in Tolkien's perspective, he sees MacDonald as a preacher. That he's trying to preach to people, and that's part of what he doesn't like. He's not trying to tell just a good story, but he's trying to bring in morals and teach a story, and that kind of compromises the story in certain ways. So, can you talk a little bit about that, and then maybe also, your essay is titled "Tolkien is Allegory." So maybe let's get into that. What is he rejecting in terms of allegory and MacDonald?
Sure. This is where it gets really interesting to me and complex as well. Because, so first of all, starting with the Golden Key, if it's an allegory, I'm not sure what to make of airfish.
Yeah. Right.
And
Haven't we all eaten airfish?
as you do. Yeah, I did some research and was looking for allegorical interpretations of the Golden Key, because if Tolkien's just sort of, throwing it off that, MacDonald's always writing allegorically, well, maybe not strictly always, but this is his general mode, then what is the Golden Key mean? And I didn't come up with much. And yet there you can feel a difference between the Golden Key and Smith of Wooton Major. And one of the differences, well, side note, the fairies in the Golden Key are very much Shakespearean fairies, these tiny little things that, come out of flowers, and Tolkien just hated that.
Right.
His fairy for Tolkien is, in fairy in Smith of Wooton Major, it's more like Lord of the Rings, where these soldiers come marching up, and it's absolutely there's danger, there's terror, there's peril in the land of fairy. So the other thing, I guess, is that Tolkien has so much invested in making his stories complete. There's an entire backstory to the family lines of the characters in Smith of Wooton Major.
Right.
Of course, there is.
That's just not something that you'd see MacDonald doing. We don't know who Tangle's great-great-grandmother was and where she came from and why Tangle ended up the way that she is. But Tolkien wanted these seamless realities. It's like he wanted realism. MacDonald almost goes to the opposite extreme and throws in things that border on feeling random. Mm-hmm. And there's
very dreamlike.
Right. There's a lot of talk about that sort of making strange, this disorientation and the way that these fantasy writers bring us into their world. The way that I see Tolkien doing it is he creates almost a history. It's very complete. And I think that's what bothered him about allegory, or moral allegory, allegorizing, is everybody was looking to his stories and saying, well, what does this mean? And if that means this, then what does this mean?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And he hated that if-then type of formula where you identify, somebody latches onto one correspondence. And I think, when Tolkien writes on fairy stories, he talks about fairy or fantasy as kind of a stew that you put different ingredients in. And I think that's a good metaphor.
Including airfish?
Yes. Yeah, and they'll all come out better off after we eat them. No, you put different ingredients into a story, and the truth is every one of those ingredients has to come from somewhere. So, he says of Smith of Wooton Major, the Alf character was inspired by the college chef at Merton College, Oxford. And he mentions that in a letter to somebody thanking him for sort of speaking against the allegorizing of his stories, of dissecting them. So Tolkien is acknowledging that these ingredients come from somewhere. And some of them are local ingredients, that come from his own life and nearby. Some of them could be from way far away. But the point is the stew. What Tolkien wants you to pay attention to is the taste of what he's putting together and the work that he's putting into that. There was a episode of Portlandia, this TV show that I thought was really funny, where this couple sit down to have chicken and they ask where it's from and is it organic, and the waitress brings out the chicken's papers and this picture of him at the farm, and they keep on asking more and more questions about this chicken, and finally they decide to have her hold their table. They're going to go visit the farm where the chicken came from, and
that's a good sketch.
And they go deeper and deeper and never come back to the table. And I think that's kind of what we can do sometimes with these stories, is we get so fixated on where did this come from that we miss the story itself. And I think that's kind of what Tolkien was pushing back against.
Right. And as I read your article, I was struck that in a way, Tolkien creates a mini allegory against allegory in Smith of Wooton Major. And you make this wonderful point just by quoting Tolkien that no, Smith of Wooton Major isn't allegory, but it contains some things that could be given an allegorical interpretation.
Allegorical elements,
Yes. What I like about that is you show that Tolkien is being far more subtle than people realize, that too many people either on one extreme just turn him into allegory. We have a letter at the Wade that Dorothy Sayers wrote to C.S. Lewis, complaining about how people were allegorizing Lord of the Rings and saying, oh, the ring represents the atomic bomb, and so then if that represents the atomic bomb, David, the other day were lecturing. They said someone represents Hitler.
Yeah, Sauron is Hitler and Saruman is Mussolini.
Right.
And the Riders of Rohan are America because they came into the war late.
Yeah. I mean, and no wonder Tolkien would be disgusted.
Yeah.
Both Lewis and Sayers were disgusted with that.
Well,
so
her letter to Lewis is funny because she says if you write allegory, people say, oh, that's so simplistic and that's so obvious. But then if you write something which isn't allegorical, like Lord of the Rings, people start allegorizing it.
Right.
So you can't possibly please critics.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is what's so fascinating about the cake in Smith of Wooton Major, because it struck me that here this cake that's made only once every 24 years, 24 children are come to eat the cake. But then this Noakes guy decides to put little treasures into the cake. And so that the children become more obsessed with finding the treasures than enjoying the cake. So that is what Tolkien is saying people do when they allegorize. They're looking for the little tidbits. Oh, the ring represents the atomic bomb. And so Smith then enjoys the cake and isn't even aware that he has swallowed the star that enables him to see fairy. So Tolkien is trying to tell us we should approach stories and swallow it and enjoy it like this cake rather than saying, oh, this has to represent that and this represents that. This is a problem in some scholarship with not only Tolkien, but Lewis. Sometimes people will go, oh, there are 3 novels in the Ransom trilogy. That must correspond to the 3 persons of the Trinity. And so they're like, rather than enjoying the stories, they're going and then having to find things to prove their theory that they're bringing to it.
Yeah.
Like having to prove the ring represents the atom bomb in Lord of the Rings. And that's just bad scholarship to come up with a pattern first so that you aren't absorbing it. And so Smith has absorbed, and as you summarize for us, Graham, then he can enjoy fairy because he's not looking for the little tidbits in the cake.
Yes, that's true from the reader's side of things and from the scholar's side. I think there's also a lot to be said there on the writer's side. And what Tolkien is partly saying in the way that he writes about that cake is that the person who's making the cake has this very demeaning view of children and what they're looking for, and of fairy, most of all. And so what he does is he makes it really sweet. That's his first idea, and put lots of sugar in the icing. And he puts this ridiculous fairy doll on top of it, because he thinks this is what children like and this is what fairy's all about. And Tolkien's very strongly making a point against that, that children, and this is very similar to what Lewis says, that children are just smaller human beings and their tastes aren't fundamentally different from adults.
Right.
There are some differences, but it's not that they only like sweet things. And certainly fairy is something much deeper and more poignant than these little dolls and things.
Yeah.
One of the things that made me think of the cake as an allegory against allegory is that Noakes writes on the cake the fairy queen. And it's important to realize that when Noakes says fairy, he spells it F-A-I-R-Y, whereas Tolkien's fairy is F-A-E-R-Y. So he wants to make a distinction between this place that your imagination can enter where you not discover, but absorb a sense that there is a reality beyond just the everyday practical realities. But anyway, by Noakes putting Fairy Queen on the cake, that is quite revelatory because Tolkien didn't like Spencer's Fairy Queen, which was spelled F-A-I-R-Y, because Spencer's Fairy Queen was an allegory. And the first time that Tolkien and Lewis met, it kind of was tense because Lewis loved the Fairy Queen and Tolkien was very dismissive of it.
So in your article, Graham, you quote Tolkien in, I think, this essay that he wrote related to Smith of Wooton Major, where he says, "This short tale is not an allegory, though it is capable, of course, of allegorical interpretations at certain points," which you just demonstrated with the cake here. But that kind of leads you to sort of part of what you're just trying to do in the article. And then you're also reacting to this essay by Shippey and Flieger, which I wanted you to talk about, the allegory versus the bounce, where they say to seek for the meaning is to cut open the ball in search of the bounce. I thought that was a good way to quantify it. But can you talk a little bit about the definition of allegory here? Because it feels like sometimes when we're talking about allegory, it's a question of like, well, what do we mean, and what is he rejecting? Because he says that he rejects it, but then the cake feels very allegorical. So what does he mean when he says that my stories aren't allegorical, when can sometimes find this correspondence?
Sure. That's exactly the question. What is allegory? What do we mean by allegory? And it's such a challenging question that's why I had to write a whole article. Not that I put the issue to rest, but what I found necessary to do to understand that was to say, okay, it's really difficult to figure out what exactly is allegory. But we have an interesting situation here where Tolkien is saying, okay, MacDonald, I don't like MacDonald's writing. He's writing allegorically often. And here's what I do like, fairy. And he defines very specifically what he means by fairy. And he puts these two sort of as in contrast. So what I see here as the opportunity in Smith of Wooton Major to understand allegory in Tolkien is that we've got kind of an anti-allegory that Tolkien specifically was writing in contrast and in critique of allegory. So I see that definition of fairy as what Tolkien doesn't mean by allegory, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So what is fairy then?
Well, I was hoping to read this passage. Yeah. It's somewhat lengthy, but it's so packed, and it's so helpful in understanding this thing that we keep using, fairy, this word. So Tolkien writes, fairy represents, at its weakest, a breaking out, at least in mind, from the iron ring of the familiar, still more from the adamantine ring of the belief that it is known, possessed, controlled, and so ultimately all that is worth being considered. A constant awareness of a world beyond these rings. More strongly, it represents love, that is, love and respect for all things, inanimate and animate, an unpossessive love of them as other. This love will produce both ruth and delight. Things seen in this light will be respected, and they will also appear delightful, beautiful, wonderful, even glorious. Fairy might be said, indeed, to represent imagination, without definition, because taking in all the definitions of this word. Aesthetic, exploratory and receptive, and artistic, inventive, dynamic, sub-creative. This compound of awareness of a limitless world outside our domestic parish, a love in ruth and admiration for the things in it, and a desire for wonder, marvels, both perceived and conceived. This fairy is as necessary for the health and complete functioning of the human as is sunlight for the physical life. Sunlight as distinguished from the soil, say, though it in fact permeates and modifies even that.
Yeah.
Is that from on fairy stories?
No, this is from the essay that Tolkien wrote on Smith of Wooton Major.
Oh, okay. Boy, that's beautiful prose, isn't it?
It's yes, and I mean this is almost a single run-on sentence. It's a very complex thought that he's trying to articulate here.
Yeah. So on the next page, you mention, and I underlined this. I thought was a very crucial distinction that MacDonald's writing lacked fairy in Tolkien's mind because it treated fantasy as a means to a religious end. And Tolkien likely associated this means-end approach with allegory. So I thought that was really insightful because it gets the idea of like, well, I'm going to write a story because I want to accomplish this. I want to teach children a certain thing, or I want to accomplish something in it, as opposed to writing a good story in and of itself. And that seems like a big theme of Tolkien's life and the way he viewed creativity in general.
Yeah. And, you can see how this would seem a bit overly critical maybe, or splitting hairs on, I mean, what's the big deal? MacDonald writes some beautiful fantasy. But I think when you really dig deep into this idea of fairy, you see that there's something so serious and so sacred to Tolkien about fairy existing on its own as something that's holy. That to try to write fantasy in order to accomplish a religious end, I think I can see from Tolkien's perspective how it would seem to bring down the status of fantasy. He didn't write anything religious into his fantasies. And he was very particular and explicit about that. And you can see how that would connect to this style where fairy within fantasy is the end. It's so holy and beautiful that it itself is the end that he's writing for.
He used that word subcreative, which we've talked about before. There's a critic named Claudio Testi who said, if you look at his works from the outside, they are Christian and religious because it's an act of subcreation. But if you look at him from the inside, he wants it to be a standalone creation. I believe in that same essay you mentioned, he says, as in my other stories, there's no temples, there's no active worship in Smith of Wooton Major. The irony for me, I wonder if it's Pilgrim's Progress that gave allegory a bad name, because most of the judge hate good is pretty obvious, and the giant despair and the slough of despond. But Fairy Queen, many characters have multiple meanings. Interestingly, both, I think I'm quoting this from your essay, both Tolkien and Lewis were very open to reader interpretations. They were almost, who's that Roland Barthes about the death of the author? That in many ways the reader has to decide what a text means. But Tolkien said, well, it's not allegory, but you have room for applicability. You can decide how it applies. And in the Fantastic Imagination, MacDonald said that a work can have many meanings, and I can't tell you what it means. And he actually says your meaning may be better than my meaning, which I don't want. When people read my books, I don't want to say that. I want to say, no, I have a meaning in mind here. But they both were kind of humble about this idea that the artist doesn't dominate. It's interesting, the passage you read, the two bad things are rings, because he associates that with domination.
Right.
I'm going to, and there's a kind of interpretive dominance, which is almost similar to political dominance of a totalitarian state. Isn't there a term in critical studies about totalizing a text, meaning you think you figured out everything it has to say?
Right.
And it's almost like the totalitarianism of hermeneutics.
Yeah, you mentioned in the article where he was critical of people sort of tearing apart Beowulf to try and understand it, and he was saying it's sort of like tearing apart a tower to understand how it works, rather than climbing up and viewing the sea from the top of the tower.
Right.
You destroy the.
He says inspecting the rocks.
Yeah.
Rather than appreciating the tower.
But isn't that kind of an allegorical picture of what interpreters are doing wrong?
That's what's so good about Graham's article, is he's showing that it's not this simplistic, either or. All allegory is bad. And if you stay away from allegory, that's good, because he admits there can be allegorical elements in something.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if we want to ask the question, did Tolkien write allegory in terms of, did he ever write anything, where one thing could mean something else? It's obvious the answer is yes, but I don't know how useful that question really is.
Yeah.
He was describing missing an experience because you were just dissecting something.
Right.
In order to understand it. And I mean, I
not
love
tasting the cake, just looking for the gems.
Yeah. Gandalf says that he who takes something apart to understand it has left the path of wisdom. And I think it's something Tolkien himself would definitely believe.
Or Wordsworth, who Lewis loved, we murder to dissect.
Yeah.
I had a professor at UCLA who had a sign on his office door that said, we murder to dissect, no job too small.
So in your article, I have another question related to your article, and then Tolkien, and I would like to see what you guys have to say about this as well. So you're talking about history versus archetypes in one section of your article, and you have some quotes in here. Tolkien is talking about his fantasy. He says, if it is to achieve, or you say, if it is to achieve fairy, it must have a history of its own. And you bring in that quote about the Lord of the Rings where he preferred history, whether real or feigned, as opposed to allegory. And you say the vital thing is they must not spoil one another. There's a self-consistency that he's looking for, a history there, and that it's well built with inner consistency on true principles. And so when he writes Smith of Wooton Major, he comes up with, like you said, the family tree, this 100-year history of this entirely fictional town. And he spends his whole life with the Silmarillion doing the same sort of thing, like essentially writing a fictional history. So I wrote in the margin of your article, because I was kind of getting frustrated with Tolkien. And I said, but it forces us to learn the history and events of an entirely fictional world if you want to extract any meaning. to leave this world, which is real, for one that is not. And my question is, why not study real history? Because we can do the same thing with real history, but then it actually does have a correspondent. It did actually happen, as opposed to Tolkien's fictional history. In other words, why not just study real history? Why invent a fake history in a world that doesn't exist? How is that better? And how does that help us with meaning?
I have an answer after Graham's.
Okay, all right.
Yes, great question. So let me hit your question directly, coming back to what exactly is allegory, and I'll weave in the history thing. You know, the way I was kind of trying to think about a model for this morning, and I think one way of seeing it is we've got three layers to three different sort of realities. There's the world that we live in. Mm-hmm. There's the world of subcreation where we create objects, and there are correspondences between those two worlds. And allegory is one of the phenomena that exists between those two layers. You know, that you go down into subcreation, you see an event, and then you can trace it to another that points back to our lived world. But then there's this higher layer of, you could call it supercreation. If there's subcreation, there's a level above. And there's a quote by Lewis that I use in here that's really key.
Yeah, related to sacramentalism.
And yeah, I'd love to read that, because I think that's what helped me understand, ironically, Lewis, helping me understand Tolkien. But I do think there's something really, really key and important here. Lewis says in The Allegory of Love, if our passions, being immaterial, can be copied by material inventions, we're talking subcreation, then it's possible that our material world in its turn is the copy of an invisible world, which would be that supercreation. As the god Amor and his figurative garden are to the actual passions of men, so perhaps we ourselves and our real world are to something else. The attempt to read that something else through its sensible imitations, to see the archetype in the copy, is what I mean by symbolism or sacramentalism. So that, to me, really fit with what Tolkien seems to be trying to do.
Yeah.
As sacramental, this is something that is sacred. There's a way of subcreating where the correspondences aren't pointing back to the lived historical world. That's not what it's about. That's not its aboutness. They're pointing straight through up to the highest level of those archetypes. And so we get stuck, I think, when we're just talking about allegory as correspondences or even as applicability. I think applicability is looking at one thing in subcreation and being able to see multiple things in the lived historical world. But that's still not what Tolkien's doing. A strict allegory would only point back to one particular thing.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's this other third way where I think we can see patterns of truth that point all the way up through the layers to the character of God himself.
And it's very Platonic.
Well,
Yes.
but here's my response to that is, if there is a real world, and if we go with Lewis's interpretation, and there's, invisible, we're pointing to invisible things. So our layer is pointing to the supercreation, and there is a correspondence there. Why go another layer down and create a fictional thing with fictional correspondences? Because can't we just find symbolism in bread, related to the true bread, or, the door and then the true door? Like, there's plenty of symbolism in this world. Why go a layer deep?
We certainly can, but what I would argue is that we are going a layer deep when we're doing that. To read history, even history is a not random collection of events that we find significant. Every person who writes history is looking for a pattern.
Gotcha.
And the pattern is what's significant. And I think at its most sort of deep and profound, those patterns do point to the archetype. So yeah, we incarnate these symbols, but Tolkien himself wrote something here about allegory that I think sort of answers this.
Okay.
He says in a letter, of course, allegory and story converge, meeting somewhere in truth, capital T, so that the only perfectly consistent allegory is a real life, and the only fully intelligible story is an allegory. And in another letter he writes, it is, I suppose, impossible to write any story that is not allegorical in proportion as it comes to life, since each of us is an allegory, embodying in a particular tale and clothed in the garments of time and place, a universal truth and everlasting life.
It's almost like the way Dorothy Sayers talks about the Imago Dei, that in Genesis 1:27, where told all humans, male and female, were made in the image of God. It's as though we are an allegory of God, and our creativity, the ability to invent stories, to create wonder through fiction, is part of our creativity that signals we are made in the image of God, who is a creator.
And Lewis also said, insofar as the visible is an emblem of the invisible, the whole universe is an allegory.
Yeah.
So it's not just us. Back to your question, Aaron, on why even be a sub-creator, why make we're exercising the image of God in us, of the creator.
Okay.
But he also has these 4 specifics on fairy stories of escape from the world in which often there isn't justice, there isn't a final resolution, there aren't clear goodness and evil. He had escape. The second one was recovery. If we start seeing the beauty of nature in Lord of the Rings and Narnia and George MacDonald, it lends a magic to nature in our world. Lewis, when he read MacDonald, said, when I read other fantasy stories, when I closed the book, the real world seemed kind of dim and thrown into shadows compared to the dazzling world of fantasy. But he said, when I read MacDonald, the bright shadow of reality came off the page and it enchanted my real world.
Gotcha.
So we have escape, we have recovery, we have consolation. Ultimately, Christians believe that the world story will have a happy ending, which every happy ending of a story is a little emblem or a synecdoche of the happy ending of world history.
Okay.
And I'm leaving one out.
So in that sense, it's almost as if, like you were saying, Graham, almost as if writing those stories is a way for us to think about and ponder the supercreation in a sense. Right, because you're putting the consolation, the eucatastrophe, the happy ending in the story because we know that that's true at the level above us. Does that make sense?
Well, this is what I think is interesting is the question that we ask dictates the range of answers we're going to get.
Right.
And if we ask the question, what does fantasy get us?
Okay.
Then we're already on a track to, in a sense, treat fantasy as a means to an end. And I don't want to be overly critical of that because I think it's a legitimate question in many senses. But this is, I think, it's the nuance that sort of differentiates Tolkien from Lewis and MacDonald.
Right.
And I think for Tolkien, to read him sympathetically, to look from his perspective, what you see is that there's something just so beautiful about subcreating itself, when all of that comes together in this holistic, organic, living. I mean, look back at the words in that list, that litany of fairy. These are all living, organic words where he's sort of describing creating a living thing that just should be itself. And that's definitely a theme in Tolkien, is for something to become more of itself. That is religious. That is the whole thing. Yeah. So it doesn't have to point somewhere else. I mean, to the degree where he even raises the question of, can these things come to life? You know, it's these tree metaphors, and the trees show up everywhere in Tolkien. It's just such a prevalent theme. He loved gardening, and this is, I think, the way to understand Tolkien is to think in these living images of helping something become more of itself, and that's the Lord of the Rings as well, because evil wants to dominate other wills,
right,
and to take away their freedom to be themselves in order to bring those wills into the self, the dominating self.
Yeah, in many ways, the opposite of Sauron would be Tom Bombadil. He's just the spirit of the countryside, but the ring doesn't affect him. He doesn't own the trees. You could argue that he's sort of an emblem of someone who, as you say, is letting everything in nature be itself.
Yeah,
that's.
He's married to a waterfall, for Pete's sake.
Yeah, it's true. You know, a lot of people argue that he doesn't fit in the story, but I really like that interpretation. He's sort of a foil for Sauron.
Okay. Those are all great responses. These are things I wrestle with Tolkien. This is probably why I align more with Lewis. The other thing that stood out to me was you were talking about the life of fairy must remain free for the believer and the unbeliever alike. This is true in all worlds, and so he wants the story, these worlds that he's creating. He doesn't put churches in them. They don't have overt religion. But that, to me, again, my one response was, well, but the real world has churches and pews and religions, and so why go out of your way to create a world that's entirely self-consistent, but leave that out, because to me that actually makes it feel like not a real world, because I can't find any society or culture in the history of the human race on the planet Earth that doesn't have religion or temples or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great point, and you're not the only one to make it. There are other, critics of Tolkien who say it's actually sort of a loud silence to try to create these worlds where religion doesn't exist, because if it were a real world, it would in some form. And my thought on it is, I think if Tolkien were to have put it in, he would have had quite a conundrum to figure out what religion it would be.
Yeah.
Because either it would be this explicit, worship of Iluvatar or something that that then everybody's going to look for and say, okay, well, tell me, how does this religion work? And are there priests? And, you'd instantly get into this. I mean, if people were trying to allegorize and moralize his stories to begin with, imagine what would happen if he had a church in them.
Oh, and I could see it becoming a real church today now.
Right. Or,
Totally.
Or on the other side, if he were to try to make it, and I think this is probably, if he were to do it, he'd do it more generally, where it could be a plausible, I don't know, it could be, if it were anything else, then everybody would be wondering, well, is it true or not? I mean, is this religion a true religion, or is it a false religion? And if it's a false religion, so.
Well, he
originally wanted to, excuse me, Crystal, he wanted to publish the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings together. So he wasn't hiding the fact that he believed in an ultimate beneficent God, because the opening of Silmarillion is very much like Genesis, and Iluvatar is clearly the sovereign God who creates the Maiar and the Valar. So he wasn't exactly ashamed of religion. I think those are really good questions, Graham. How would it fit in? There's one scene with Faramir and his group up in the mountains. They all bow to the east, and I think they bow to the west, don't they, before a meal. But in general, he didn't like the Arthurian legend. I think, Graham, you mentioned that in your article, because it depends upon the Holy Grail and religion, so it loses its sub-creative independence from our world.
David, tell the story of your student back in Pennsylvania who couldn't understand why Lion Witch in the Wardrobe was Christian, and her response.
Well, she read Lion Witch in the Wardrobe, and she said, I don't understand why people say it's a Christian story. And she said, I liked it, but I didn't get why it was considered religious. And I said, well, Aslan dies for someone else's fault. They're heartbroken because he's gone, but then he returns and they're all jubilant. Does that remind you of anything? And she said, oh, do you mean like Gandalf?
Okay. Why I wanted David to share that's a perfect example of the student picking up on the archetype of what both Tolkien and Lewis called the dying God myth, and how Tolkien brought C.S. Lewis to Christianity, was convincing him, even though there are all these dying and then resurrecting God myths throughout history, that the Christian myth became fact. It was actually Jesus was an historical figure that was written about by people like Josephus. And so I think that works much more powerfully, that archetype, than if it were an explicit religion. And I'm just reinforcing what you said, where people would say, oh, I don't think I could believe that. And, well, the trouble is that's not like the way I was brought up.
Right.
Get them to feel the wonder, and the passage you quoted, that word wonder was there. The wonder of sacrificial love, that a powerful being would choose to die for others so they could live. That is the basis of Christianity. And it's like all these other religions have a sense of it, but it actually happened in history, according to Christians.
And going even farther, to say that there's no religion as such in Tolkien's writings isn't to say that there is no sacred and profane.
Yes.
Oh, definitely.
Yes,
right.
exactly.
No good or evil.
Yeah, certainly good and evil, but even a recognition of things that are sacred, things that are holy, and things that are diabolical. So, and I think when you can see with Tolkien's eyes the weight, the importance of the sacred and profane being recognized, religion as such, as a social practice or an institution. Well, I mean, he was Catholic, so certainly he had a high view of that. I don't think that he was saying that church doesn't matter, but I think for fantasy, he's showing the basic elements and not trying to draw it up into a historical conundrum
cultural
of time
practice.
and space.
It's interesting how other Christian artists aren't asked to justify their art. A sculptor or a potter or a painter or a musician, people don't say, well, how does that worship God, or how's that an expression?
Yeah.
But when it comes to literature, since words have meaning, people tend to, I think there is something Catholic about that beautiful passage you read. Lewis loved communion. When his son was struggling with his faith, he said, try to go take the Eucharist every day. Tolkien loved communion. He loved the worship, but he didn't like the homily or the sermon.
Yeah.
He actually told his son, go to a church where it doesn't have a good sermon. It's an ugly church. The other people there are wearing hair curlers. And you'll know exactly why you're there, which is to meet the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So I agree that his high view of worship that he felt as a Catholic got into his view of art.
Yeah.
Protestants tend to be more evangelistic. I need to use my art to affect my readers or my listeners.
And hence allegory.
Yeah, but I think that question comes up, David, because if you had somebody like Tolkien who was a very devout Catholic and was loved Christ and saw sacramentalism, believed in the Eucharist and the Lord's Supper, but say they were a sculptor and they never made a sculpture of any religious thing, no religious figures. There was never a crucifix in it, right? Like that would be a question that people would discuss after they died. Like, why did he, if he was so involved in the church, why did he never make any sort of sacramental art? You know what I mean?
That's why Sayers said the only Christian work is good work well done. It doesn't matter if they don't make any religious images. She would, when her play The Zeal of Thy House was put up, there were these dramatic angels. And someone asked her and said, well, did you find really sincere, earnest Christians to play the angels? And she said, what I looked for were people who were good actors who could stand there for the whole 90-minute play with these huge wings on and wouldn't faint, and their ability, whether they're Christian or not, is more to the glory of God than if they were good Christians.
Okay. I'm just saying there's a lot of really great Christian works of art that contain over-religious imagery, so it's not like that immediately makes it a bad piece of art. So that's why I was just saying, to me, the question stands out because we know he was a Christian. Why not create a overtly Christian piece of art?
You run into this a lot. There's someone like Bach who used his musical skills to write music, but it's not didactic, whereas Isaac Watts or Charles Wesley, their musical composition ability, they immediately want to turn into hymns and acts of explicit worship. But I'm glad to have both. To me, it's the body concept in Corinthians, that the eye and the hand should appreciate each other. I think that comes up a lot, though. I think you often get these pairings like a Lewis and a Tolkien or a Bach and a Wesley that have a different view of their artistic gifts.
And our world is richer for it. No, I'm not trying to slam on Tolkien or anything. It just to me, I was saying, I think that's why the question keeps coming up.
By the way, we're not slamming on Tolkien. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the individuals.
No, we're not.
No, actually, we're talking about the fact that Tolkien is far more sophisticated than people have made him out to be by either simplistically allegorizing his works or saying, no, he hated allegory. He never did any allegory. Right.
Yeah. And I've always been more traditionally a Lewis fan. I'm somewhat new to Tolkien, but I think that it's we need both. We need the explicit and the implicit. I think the danger is that when we exclusively live in the world of the explicit, we start to lose an appreciation for the necessity of those deep things underneath, and thinking, I think there's a lot of people who would never become a potter or a sculptor because they don't see an opportunity to be explicit in that.
True.
Right.
And I do think that that's a shame because I don't think that that's God's design for the world and for his kingdom.
Yeah.
Well, T.S. Eliot, people are talking about how hard it was to extract the themes from some of his poems. And he, very much like MacDonald, he said, I'm trying to evoke emotions. And he said, I'm like the burglar who throws a piece of raw meat to the dog, which is the theme. And while they're sniffing, then I sneak in and do what I want to do. So he had a very similar view that searching for a theme, it's like looking for the tokens inside the cake. But actually, sometimes stories that you don't understand stick with you more than stories you do understand.
Yes.
There's a section in Fantastes called the Cosmos story. Anodos reads this story in a book about this young man who sees a beautiful woman. When he looks in a mirror, he sees her in the room, but when he turns around, she's not there. And you go, is that an allegory? But that story, I've never been able to say, here's what I think it means, but I'm still thinking about it several decades after the first time I wrote it.
Yeah.
That was
I read it.
That was my experience of Till We Have Faces. It was the first book of Lewis that I ever read, and it just haunted me, and it kicked off my whole interest in the Inklings, Lewis and
Interesting.
together. It was something that just stuck with me and drew me in to know more. You know?
Well, I have to say, I really enjoyed your article. I encourage you guys to get a copy of the article. You can actually go online. The journal is available online. So I think it's journals.wheaton.edu, and then you can go to 7 and you can get a copy of the article or the whole issue and check it out. So, yeah.
I've seen some articles that I say this could have been condensed into a footnote. But this article, I would say this could be expanded into a book.
Yeah.
It's so much to think about there.
Yeah.
Because you could do the whole nature of allegory and symbolism, and then MacDonald's take on it, Tolkien's take on it.
We could apply
Lewis's
it to all the
take on it.
Inklings, really. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very rich article.
Yeah.
Appreciate
Thank
that,
you
Graham.
so much, Graham, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Are we going to call this episode, did we decide to call it Smith of Major Confusion? Or
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, past collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.